Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Squiggly Career Podcast from Amazing If. Each week, myself, Helen Tupper, and my co-founder, Sarah Ellis,
Hi,
are here to help everyone have a happy career. We take some of the challenges and decisions that we know everyone is faced with at some point in their career, and we share our experiences and some tips that you can action, and also some resources that we think can help you explore. Sarah and I spent over 30 years between us working in sales and marketing roles for big companies and for small companies, and we've been running Amazing If now alongside those jobs for over 5 years, and we're using all of that experience to bring our insights together into these weekly podcasts for you. So hopefully you'll find something that can help you in your career. This week we're going to be talking about difficult conversations. Hopefully this isn't something you're faced with every day, but we do know that when you're faced with difficult conversations, they can feel really, really challenging and affect even the most confident of people. And we've both had lots of experience with difficult conversations and hopefully learned some things from it that were useful for you. So let's get started. Sarah, what's your experience of difficult conversations?
So actually we were chatting about this before today when we were getting some examples ready to talk about. And in lots of ways I find this hard to even come up with examples because I don't like having difficult conversations. So my default mode on difficult conversations is avoidance, but that absolutely isn't the way to go. So I don't recommend following that approach at all. But I can definitely talk from the perspective of somebody who there's something that, preoccupy me. I'd spend lots of time worrying about them and I'd get myself, kind of really het up before having a difficult conversation. I think the ones I find hardest are where you're not expecting them. So if you've had time to prepare, it somehow just feels a bit easier because you can think about what you're going to say, you can maybe practice it. But I've had quite a few experiences in my career where a conversation has become a difficult conversation and it was something I wasn't ready for. And what I really feel I learned from those is that actually you need to work out how to react in the right way. So because you can't prepare, because you don't know it's coming, my natural default when I'm faced with that kind of challenging conversation is to become more and more introverted. So the first thing I'd say is when a difficult conversation happens that you're not expecting, work out how you respond. Do you get aggressive? Some people I see get very aggressive very quickly. Some people get really defensive. Some people like me get quite quiet and withdrawn. And then work out almost what's your coping strategy. Because I don't think you need to be amazing in these conversations because, it's a tough situation. But you do need to work out how do you make sure you still come out of that conversation understanding more than when you started. And my approach has become asking questions. I just find that rather than stopping to talking completely or getting defensive, if I just go on to a kind of mode of thinking, okay, I wasn't ready for this, I just need to understand because I wasn't ready, I'd obviously not anticipated it. I'm just going to ask as many questions as I can. I'm not going to try and come up with any answers, and I'll try and just make sure that by the end of this conversation I've understood why this has ended up being a difficult conversation. And as long as I've done that, I'll then worry about what I need to do next afterwards.
I think as well, questions can give you sometimes a bit of distance and also some time to think, because I think the problem with difficult conversations is they can be loaded with emotion. And then it just takes away your objectivity and your ability to have a reasoned conversation, and all those things that you're talking about, defensiveness, suddenly come in. So sometimes just asking a question, both because it's a way of just calming down that conversation, also gives you just time to think and just think, hang on, how am I really responding to this? How do I remove some of the emotion that is not helping me or this conversation move forward?
Yeah, and a few good questions I've seen other people use and that I've basically stolen is some very senior people I've often seen who probably the more senior you are, I guess, often you don't know what conversations are going to be because you're pulled in so many different directions. And I worked for somebody who used to sort of say, tell me a bit more about that. Or, can you just talk to me a bit more about that? And actually sometimes it wasn't because it was a difficult conversation, but it was clearly a response to, I maybe haven't quite understood or I wasn't expecting you to talk about this. Can you just tell me a bit more about that? Gives the other person the opportunity as well to really explain and explore everything they want to get off their chest. And you almost need to do that before you can move on. So you're just checking that somebody has told you everything they feel like they need to tell you. So that's one really good question. And then the other good question that I found quite helpful is often asking something that starts with why. So, why do you think that's happened? Why do you think you feel like that? Or, what are your observations about this situation? So that, again, you're asking somebody to give their personal perspective, their point of view, And that can sometimes help you as well with then what you need to do in terms of solutions. Because if you know the why, like why someone's upset, why someone's disappointed, why someone thinks something should be done in a different way, actually you might then have some empathy or sympathy with that point of view and think, actually, I can understand that now. And even if you've got a different point of view, at least you know the why. So I think, tell me more about that, and asking why are basically my two default questions as part of my coping strategy for really hating difficult conversations.
And just, I think one build on the word why that I learned from a coach a while ago is you have to be really careful with how you phrase a why question to somebody, because sometimes they can be defensive in response to it. So if you're going, why do you think that, in that kind of term, that kind of way of positioning it, it can sort of put someone's back up, and it might not help you to reduce that emotion that we're talking about. So I think, what's important to you about this? That's interesting. What's your perspective on it? Sometimes it's essentially the why question, but it softens it sometimes. It depends on the individual, and I think sometimes the emotion of the conversation. But I think why is a very powerful question. It's really insightful, but sometimes you can use it in a way that sometimes makes someone else be defensive if it's sort of justifying their point.
Yeah, I think actually that's a really good perspective. I think maybe you're trying to ask a why question, but you're actually using the word what. Because as you were just talking there, I was thinking actually probably you do end up using what. Like, what do you think? What else can you tell me? What do you think we should do? All feels probably more collaborative and kind of softer than, well,
why do you think that? Why do you think that? Why do you think we should do this?
So you are trying to understand, and kind of broadly that is about the why, but I think you're right, that's a really good perspective.
What else has been difficult for you conversationally?
So slightly different. So a difficult conversation that I was really prepared for was when I was working at Sainsbury's. I decided I wanted to work a 4-day week so that I could work on Amazing If. And there's not very many other people I know within any organisations who work flexibly so that they can also run their own business on the side.
Agreed.
Yeah. And so that felt like a really big deal to ask to do that. So I was still really motivated in my job at Sainsbury's. I loved what I did. I loved who I worked for. But equally, it was really important to me to have an extra day to spend on the work that we do together. And I was so nervous about this conversation. I'd made lots of assumptions about the organisation, the response I was going to have. I'd massively over-prepared. I mean, I'd done a PowerPoint presentation about why 4 days a week was such a positive thing for everyone, with diagrams.
We should put that online. I think people would like that.
We definitely should not. I really hope I haven't got it. It was awful. And it then also distracted me. So it wasn't good for my work. It wasn't good generally. And almost then when I had the conversation, it was probably one of the easier conversations I've ever had with my line manager at the time, who very quickly understood what I was asking, didn't need all the explanation. And actually, I probably already knew that she'd never be able to say yes there and then. She was always going to have to go and talk to some other people. And so really, that was a 10 to 15 minute conversation where I needed to explain what it was I wanted to do and why I wanted to do it, and give her the information she needed, answer any questions she'd got, because it was always going to be a bit of a few step process. But I had made it into my mind into a difficult conversation, and also just had put loads of barriers and assumptions up. And then actually still had the conversation. It was really positive, which I think really threw me for a start. I didn't quite know how to react. And then we had subsequent conversations, all of which were again really positive. And so I think one of my kind of observations sometimes is just be careful to not always assume something is going to be difficult. Actually, until you have the conversation, you actually don't know how people are going to react. And often people are more positive or more understanding than you perhaps think they will be, because in your head it's so important. You've really kind of made it massive, and so it starts to dominate all of your thinking.
One of the things I try to do as a manager, by the way, in no way a perfect manager, but one of the things I do try to do in my one-to-ones with my team is ask them where they want to start the conversation, because sometimes I find that somebody might have something that they want to talk about that to them is a very difficult thing. And I've had conversations with people for an hour, which has been all about what's going on at work and that we need to work on this. And at the end, I'll say, anything else? And then this thing that they've wanted to talk about the entire meeting, you do in like 2 minutes at the end. And it's meant that you don't give give that really important, what might be a difficult conversation to them, enough time. And also they've probably spent the other 55 minutes of that meeting thinking about, when can I talk to Helen about this thing? How can I do this thing? So I now try to create the space for someone else to lead that conversation and say, what's most important to you? What do you want to talk about today? So that if somebody has got this difficult thing in their mind, I've created the space and hopefully a climate where it's comfortable for them to talk to me about that. So if you're a manager, I would really encourage you to help people to not feel that difficult conversations should be so difficult to start.
Yeah, I think that is so true. I am definitely someone who has something to talk about and does everything else first. Because if you find it hard, you do everything else first because it's easier and you're working your way up to it. And I have definitely had conversations where then I never get to it. And I basically bottle it and think, oh no, I can't do it, I'll do it next time. But then you come away from that feeling really frustrated, and your manager can't do anything about that because they didn't even know you had it. I'm going to start doing that. That's a really good question.
I do it very much in, the very formal development reviews, because I always feel like people have got like I'd like to be promoted, or I would like to go to this other job, and I just think I'd just rather talk about that, because you're not going to listen to anything else meaningfully that we're going to talk about if that's what you're coming to this meeting with. So, okay.
So what about you? I sense you're probably slightly more comfortable than me usually having these kind of conversations, would you say?
I don't know, So,
or maybe just better at them.
I don't know that either. So Sarah and I come at things quite differently, because Sarah's a bit more of an introvert, I'm more of an extrovert. But I irritate myself with my lack of confidence with difficult conversations, because I don't like that about myself. I really want to be bold and confident about all the conversations I have, but you attach so much emotional significance to certain things, which for me might be, giving someone some challenging feedback or asking for something that I think, someone's going to say no to me. You attach so much to it in your head, so many assumptions, so much emotion, that I go through the inner monologue of, what are they going to say? How much can I prepare? And I think a couple of instances and experiences that I've had of this, the first one was, I had a really difficult relationship with a manager a couple of years ago. And I wanted to give that manager some feedback because I was actually feeling really unhappy about the dynamic, and it was affecting my work. I think it was affecting how I was managing my team and the workload, and I just didn't feel like I had the control that I wanted to have to do my best work. And we had, a bit of friction between us in that relationship, and that conversation felt so difficult for me. And I actually had a coach at the time, and I was trying to prepare for it. And ultimately I had the conversation, so I feel quite proud that I had that conversation, but there was a lot of angst that went into it. And so I think what I learned from that was really difficult conversations. It helps to do some preparation. So to sit down and to think, actually, what am I trying to ask? What am I trying to get out of this conversation, rather than just to go in it and splurge. So I quite like a bit of structure generally, and it helped me to think about what do I want to get out of this conversation beforehand, write down a couple of points. So this is how I'm feeling. This is what I think could be done differently. What do you think? And almost have those steps in my mind. Yeah. And then in the conversation, I can't remember how I had it written down. I had sort of the bullet points I wanted to go through. But I remember I had a pen and paper, and so that when the manager was sort of responding to me, I was just writing down the notes, and it gave me a little bit of objectivity. We're talking about it took that emotion out. The fact that I was listening in order to sort of write it down, it just created a bit of distance, so that I wasn't my instant reaction wasn't to respond and to justify and to defend. It was just to write it down and almost acknowledge it and say, okay, this is your perspective, this is how I'm feeling. It just helped me to get a bit of distance. So I think my lesson there was, sometimes those really difficult conversations, they are not as bad as you think you're going to be. You prepare for them and have that structure in your mind so that you can have a bit of a flow to the conversation and not get lost in the emotion.
My other observation, just listening to you there talk about how you would react to having that kind of conversation, goes back to think about what kind of personality you are. So I think what you'd observe there was your natural reaction to having that kind of difficult conversation with a manager might be to respond too quickly. So you'd put in a kind of mechanism to stop that happening.
Absolutely.
And so for you, that was, I'm going to force myself to pause by writing some stuff down.
Yes.
Now, if you're the opposite way round and you think, actually, I'm someone who kind of puts my head down, I don't make eye contact, etc., that's where maybe you make sure you do the opposite.
Your questions that you mentioned earlier.
So I think just having difficult conversations ends up being a really personal thing, depending on which bits you find hard. So think for yourself about what are the barriers for me, what's holding me back from difficult conversations, and then how can I put in these small little almost like tips and tricks that will just mean that I get the most from the conversation.
And I think a different experience for me that I also find difficult, and I'm trying to really work on this, is giving people feedback.
Yeah.
That often feels like a difficult conversation to do. Particularly, I'm talking about the feedback that might be a bit more challenging, which is ultimately to help somebody to grow and develop.
Yeah.
But I think in my mind, I'm thinking, how is this person going to respond? I really want to be really direct, because actually when I've had feedback that's really direct, you kind of might breathe in a bit at first and go, a little bit painful, but really, really effective. Sarah gives me that feedback. It's really, really useful. And I know how valuable that feedback is. So I want to give that to other people, but I'm so aware of how they might feel about it that I just think, I again have the internal monologue. What am I trying to say? How am I going to deliver it? Don't make it too soft, but then don't make it too hard. And you just kind of get into this thing. But I think more recently, I actually have been listening to an audiobook called Radical Candor, and it has talked about how actually you're not really helping the other person when you soften that message so that they can't hear what you're trying to say to them. You're not helping them to grow, and actually you're doing them a disservice, and it's more about you. It's more about how you feel.
Yeah, you're protecting yourself, aren't you?
Absolutely. So it's actually quite selfish. They call it ruinous empathy is what they call it, but it's almost like, so you're being so empathetic about their feelings that it's almost quite ruinous to them. You're not helping them develop, and it's inherently a selfish thing to do. And I think when you frame that sort of difficult conversation like that, so actually you're being selfish by not giving someone this feedback, and actually being as direct and specific as possible is a way of helping that person, as long as you're not, being really aggressive and mean about it. You find a way to do it that just feels quite neutral. That's more about them. And I think framing those difficult conversations like that in my mind have really helped me to just relook at how I share that feedback with somebody, whereas before I might have felt a bit more uncomfortable about doing it.
And one of my observations around feedback, which I actually don't think very many individuals or organisations are brilliant at. I don't think there are that many examples I can think of yet. I think people are starting to now appreciate the value of it, but it is hard, isn't it? It's a hard thing to get right. Often the reason people don't have these kind of difficult conversations around feedback is you worry about how people are going to respond. There's a lot of, I could be direct, as you've just described, but then what happens if somebody walks out of the room, bursts into tears, has those kind of reactions? And I think the other thing you have to remember is that you can't control how somebody is going to respond. The only thing you can control is how you deliver that feedback, and doing it in the best way possible with the best intentions of wanting that person to grow and develop. And if you do everything you just described, then that's actually, you have done your job and done that really well. Someone might still burst into tears, but that's not because you've not done a good job. And I think that's often one of the things that people get scared about with difficult feedback and difficult conversations is, well, how is someone else going to respond? And you just have to be careful not to take kind of personal accountability for somebody else's responses.
That's such a good point. I think Sarah's so good at giving feedback. So as you sort of go, I felt like I've got a little lesson there. Really, really good point about accountability for someone else's feelings. I haven't thought about it like that before. Okay, so maybe let's move on to some specific tips for people then that we might not have touched on so far. What are yours?
Definitely practice, number one. So if you know you've got a difficult conversation, like the feedback we just talked about, or you can prepare, saying it, and when I say practice, I mean saying it out loud. I find it incredibly valuable because it stops the fluff. It stops me doing too much stuff around the edges, which I suppose is kind of the same thing. And it just means that I can practice what am I going to say in what order, and make sure I say the most important thing first. So I think let's always do that. And I think secondly, finding someone who can help you almost as part of this process, who's probably not involved in the process.
Interesting.
So I remember particularly one guy who I'm really good friends with, who knew I found difficult conversations hard. He almost became my kind of like go-to person when I was about to have a difficult conversation. So I'd almost tell him I was going to do it.
Yeah.
It would also make me do it because I told him.
Yeah.
I'd go off and do it. He'd be nothing to do with it. And then afterwards he'd be like, okay, so how did it go? Are you all right? Do you want a coffee? And we'd have like a quick 5-10 minute chat. And over the course of a couple of years, and he was somebody I trusted, who knew me really well, I got so much better at those kind of conversations because I had somebody sort of waiting in the wings, A, to hold me to account, to sort of say, have you done it? And secondly, to say, like, well done, what could have gone better? And just somebody probably who is on your side when you're doing something quite tough is quite helpful. So Mr. Hampson, if you're out there listening, you know who you are. And I will always be grateful. And he's very good at this as well. So I also picked someone who was very good at this.
Yeah.
So he could actually also give me some practical advice as well as just being a supportive person.
So maybe the secondary tip in there is have a look at people that you think do this well, because
that's true.
that could be the person that could really help you. I think mine, we touched on earlier, is about be prepared to listen. So when you're having a difficult conversation, sometimes you can almost overscript it in your mind, I think. So I'm going to say this, I'm going to assume they're going to respond like this, and then this is what I'm going to say, and then you kind of, you predetermine it. And actually you need to start with articulating how you feel or whatever that message is, and then you just need to create some space for them to talk. And you might acknowledge what they're saying, but you don't need to respond, you don't need to justify. And I think don't sort of script that entire conversation, just script the start of it for you, and also understand what you want to get out of the end of it.
Yeah, so I think on that point, really listen to the actual words people are saying. I have got that wrong quite a few times because I've made assumptions. So just stop and listen. So maybe only when we talked about practice, maybe the bit you say out loud is the first bit. Because actually maybe if you practice too much, you're making too many assumptions. Maybe work out how to start. Starting's usually the hardest bit. And then just think, and then I'm just going to see how it goes from there.
And then just have a listening and questioning kind of mindset that you're going to go with. And then my last thing is about rewarding yourself, because I think we build these up in our minds. And, Sarah and I are talking about it now, but we do this as well. We're not perfect at this. It's kind of what we're learning about it, but we build.
I think it's relatively clear we're not perfect. By the way,
great.
I don't think we need to sort of state that.
All of our podcasts are sharing all of our experiences. But I think you still build them up in your mind, and I think it's just good afterwards to acknowledge that you've done it. You've had that conversation. That's quite a big step. You could have just kept this in your mind and not said anything, and you've not moved forward. But the fact that you've actually confronted something that you feel difficult requires some reward, and whatever that reward looks like for you, whether it is going for a walk outside or going to grab a coffee or listening to a podcast or leaving work early, whatever it is, I think just consciously give yourself a pat on the back and acknowledge that you have done something that you found quite difficult, because I think then it just makes it a bit easier next time, because you can lean on that fact and think, well, it wasn't so bad last time. Actually, I feel a bit more confident in doing this next time.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. Any resources that you'd recommend for people if they want to read or watch any other stuff on this?
Yeah, there's a couple that I found that I think are quite useful for people. So the first one is a video which is on Lean In's website, and it's about difficult conversations, and it's got a discussion guide. So if you just search for Lean In and the Difficult Conversations discussion guide, that would be a good one.
It's a good, sounds like a good resource.
Also, it's quite a nice worksheet to go through. This one is on, I know, it depends what you like. I know it sounds a bit retro, but I think it depends how people deeply want to go into this. So if you want to start thinking about it and doing a few exercises, there's someone called Judy Ringer, and she is a power and presence trainer, which I think sounds really impactful. And she has got a checklist for powerful conversations and openings. So again, that's on Judy Ringer's website. And the last thing is an article from Harvard Business Review. And it's got some really good examples about how other people approach difficult conversations. The article is called How to Handle Difficult Conversations at Work, and that's on Harvard Business Review's website.
Great stuff. So that's everything for this week. If you are having a difficult conversation, good luck.
Yes.
Our thoughts are with you.
Yes.
I hope it goes well, and I hope some of the ideas and things that we've talked about today are useful. Next week, we're going to be talking about a subject very close to our hearts, which is side projects. How to start a side project, what are the barriers to doing it, why you should even bother doing one in the first place. And obviously, to kind of preempt it, we're massive advocates. So not one to listen to. If you want to say why not to do one, we're very much supportive of the side project. Please do stay in touch. As always, you can follow us on Instagram. Send us your ideas for any future episodes at amazing_if, or email us at getintouch@amazingif.com. We're really keen to make sure we cover the topics that are important to you in your careers, in your personal development. So please tell us what you'd like us to discuss. And thanks very much for listening. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.
Bye.